The night was unusually quiet in the kingdom of Blackridge. The palace torches flickered in the cold wind, casting long shadows across the stone walls. Queen Victoria Steele, dressed in a royal blue gown, sat beside her father, King Edward, in the grand dining hall. "You must be careful, Victoria," the king said, his deep voice filled with concern. "There are those who would rather see you dead than let you rule." Victoria tightened her grip on her goblet. "Let them try," she said, her voice steady. "I will not cower in fear." The king smiled proudly. "That is why you were born to lead." But before another word could be spoken, a deafening crash echoed through the hall. The doors burst open, and a masked assassin rushed forward, a dagger gleaming in the firelight. "Father!" Victoria cried, reaching for the sword at her side. But it was too late. The assassin drove the dagger deep into the king's chest. The old king gasped, his eyes widening in shock as blood seeped from his wound. Guards stormed into the room, tackling the assassin to the ground, but Victoria barely noticed. She dropped to her knees, cradling her father's body. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Please, don't leave me." The king coughed, blood staining his lips. "You are the Alpha Queen now," he gasped. "Do not trust anyone." And with that, the great King Edward Steele took his last breath. Victoria's body shook with rage and grief. The assassin was dragged away, but she knew this was no random attack. Someone in her court wanted the king dead. Someone wanted her off the throne before she even had a chance to sit on it. She stood up slowly, her blue eyes burning with fury. "I will find who did this," she vowed. "And I will make them pay." The morning after the assassination, the Council of Elders gathered in the Great Hall. A group of old men, dressed in long robes, sat on high chairs, whispering among themselves. At the center of the room, Victoria stood tall, dressed in black armor, her sword strapped to her hip. "The kingdom needs a strong ruler," Lord William, the head of the council, said. "A woman on the throne will bring weakness." Victoria clenched her fists. "My father named me his heir," she said firmly. "Are you questioning his decision?" "The people need proof of your strength," another elder, Lord Thomas, added. "Tradition demands that a ruler be tested before they wear the crown." Victoria narrowed her eyes. "What kind of test?" Lord William smirked. "A battle. You must fight one of our strongest warriors. If you lose, you must step down and let a man take your place." A murmur spread through the hall. Everyone knew that Victoria was skilled in combat, but this was a direct challenge to her right to rule. "Who will I fight?" she asked, her voice steady. The doors opened, and a towering warrior stepped forward. His name was Richard Blackwood, a former general, known for his brutality on the battlefield. He was twice Victoria's size, his muscles hardened by years of war. Victoria met his gaze without fear. "I accept the challenge." A large crowd gathered in the palace courtyard. The sun blazed overhead as Victoria and Richard stood opposite each other, swords in hand. "Are you sure you want to do this, Your Majesty?" Richard sneered. It would be a shame to ruin that pretty face. Victoria smirked. "You talk too much," she said, lunging forward. Their swords clashed with a sharp ring. Richard swung his blade with brute force, but Victoria was faster. She dodged his attacks, moving like a shadow, her instincts sharp as a wolf's. Richard growled in frustration. "Stay still, damn it." Victoria grinned. "Why? So you can hit me." With a swift movement, she spun and slashed her sword across his chest. Richard stumbled back, blood staining his tunic. The crowd gasped. "Yield," she commanded. Richard hesitated, his pride wounded. But when he saw the fire in her eyes, he knew he had lost. He dropped his sword to the ground. The crowd erupted in cheers. Victoria turned to the council. "Do you still doubt me?" Lord William scowled but said nothing. Victoria raised her sword. "I am Queen Victoria Steele, the Alpha Queen. And I will not be challenged again." Later that night, Victoria stood on the castle balcony, staring at the moonlit sky. She had won the battle, but the war for the throne was far from over. "You fight well for a queen." She turned sharply, her hand on her sword. A man stepped out of the shadows, a tall, dark-haired warrior with a scar running down his cheek. "Who are you?" she demanded. "Prince Alexander of Westmere," he said with a smirk. I believe we have a common enemy. Victoria studied him carefully. Westmere was a neighboring kingdom, one that had long been at odds with Blackridge. And why should I trust you? She asked. Because the same men who killed your father destroyed my kingdom, Alexander said. If you want revenge, you're going to need me. Victoria hesitated. She had spent her whole life fighting men like him. But if what he said was true, then their enemy was greater than she had imagined. She extended her hand. Then let's make a deal. Alexander took her hand, his grip strong. To war, then. To war, she agreed. As Victoria prepared for battle, whispers of treachery filled the palace. Someone within her inner circle was feeding information to the enemy. She turned to her royal advisor, James Hart, a man she had known since childhood. Find the traitor, she ordered. James hesitated. Are you sure you can trust Alexander? Victoria narrowed her eyes. Why do you ask? James sighed. Because the prophecy speaks of betrayal from the one you trust most. Victoria's heart pounded. Could Alexander be playing her? Or was the real traitor closer than she realized? Before she could respond, a messenger burst into the room, breathless. My queen, the enemy is at our gates. Victoria's blood burned with fury. There was no time for doubts. She grabbed her sword. Then let them come. The horns of war echoed through the city as enemy soldiers swarmed toward the gates of Blackridge. The kingdom was under siege. Queen Victoria stood on the castle walls, her golden armor gleaming under the pale moonlight. Her hands tightened around the hilt of her sword as she watched the enemy advance. Banners of the Empire of Ashwood, her greatest rival, waved in the night wind. They came sooner than expected, Prince Alexander said as he stepped beside her. Victoria glanced at him. Perhaps they had help from within. Alexander's expression hardened. You still suspect me? I suspect everyone, she said coldly. Before he could respond, a flaming arrow whistled through the air, striking the wooden gate below. Another followed. Then another. Victoria turned to her general. James, mobilize the warriors. We hold the walls at all costs. James bowed quickly. Yes, my queen. As he ran off, Victoria drew her sword. Alexander, fight with me. He smirked. Try to keep up, your majesty. Together, they leaped into battle. The clash of steel rang through the night as Victoria led her warriors into the fight. She moved like a shadow, her sword cutting through enemy soldiers with precision. A hulking knight lunged at her, swinging a massive axe. She ducked, rolled to the side, and sliced across his knee. He roared in pain before she ended him with a swift strike to the throat. Alexander fought beside her, his twin blades flashing in the firelight. Not bad, queen, he called as he took down two enemies at once. Victoria smirked. You're not terrible yourself. Suddenly, a horn sounded from the enemy ranks. The Ashwood warlord, a monstrous figure in black armor, rode forward on horseback. His blade was drenched in blood. Victoria Steele, he bellowed. Face me if you dare. The battlefield fell silent. Victoria wiped the sweat from her brow. Very well. She stepped forward, her grip tightening around her sword. James grabbed her arm. My queen, it's too dangerous. Victoria shook him off. I am the Alpha Queen. I do not run from battle. With that, she charged. The warlord dismounted, gripping his sword, a massive blade that could cleave a man in two. You should have stayed in your castle, little girl, he taunted. Victoria smirked. And you should have stayed in your grave. The warlord roared and swung his blade with terrifying speed. Victoria barely dodged, the wind of the swing brushing against her face, aiming for his side, but he blocked it with inhuman strength, pushing her back. You are strong, he admitted. But not strong enough. He charged again. Victoria sidestepped, slashing his arm. Blood dripped onto the ground. Not bad, she said. But I thought warlords were supposed to be fearsome. The warlord roared in rage and swung wildly. Victoria ducked, rolled beneath his strike, and drove her sword into his gut. The warlord gasped. His eyes widened in shock. Victoria twisted the blade. This is my kingdom. She pulled out her sword, and the warlord collapsed. The battlefield erupted in cheers. The enemy, seeing their leader fall, began to retreat. Victoria raised her blooded sword high. Blackridge stands. Her warriors cheered in victory. After the battle, Victoria returned to the castle, exhausted but victorious. As she sat in the throne room, James entered, his expression grim. "My queen," he said, bowing. "We found something disturbing." He gestured, and 2 guards dragged a prisoner forward, one of the castle servants. The man trembled in fear. Victoria frowned. "What is this?" James stepped closer. He was caught sneaking messages to the enemy. Victoria's eyes darkened. "Who are you working for?" she demanded. The servant shook his head, terror in his eyes. Please, my queen. I was only following orders." Victoria's blood turned cold. "Whose orders?" The servant hesitated. James pressed a knife to his throat. "Speak, or die." The man gulped. "It was Lord William. He promised me gold if I helped weaken the defenses." Victoria's fists clenched. "The head of the council. Find him," she ordered. "Now." Victoria stormed into Lord William's chambers, her sword drawn. The old man sat calmly, sipping wine. "Ah, your majesty. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "You betrayed me," she spat. He sighed. "Did you really think the council would let a woman rule? Your father was a fool for naming you his heir." Victoria's eyes burned with fury. "And you are a fool for underestimating me." She stepped closer. "Give me one reason not to kill you right now." William chuckled. "Because the prophecy is not yet fulfilled." Victoria froze. "What do you mean?" she demanded. The old man smirked. "The one you trust most will be your downfall." Her breath caught in her throat. Could it be? Before she could ask more, he lunged. She barely dodged the dagger aimed at her heart. In one swift motion, she drove her sword through his chest. Lord William gasped, his smirk fading. "The prophecy." He choked, before falling lifeless to the ground. Victoria stood over his body, breathing heavily. James rushed in. "My queen, are you hurt?" Victoria shook her head, but her mind raced.